started now.
Nice. All right. So, you'll need to make me a co-host. Perfect. Thank you. All right. So, in terms of the cap itself, so this is how I've written out the API reference now. So it looks very much like how the APIs look if you look at the Kubernetes API repository. So I've kind of used the same tags and follow the same style here as much as possible. So done it for the other resources too. Other than that, I think we talked about bucket info where we earlier we had um, the object meta and type meta, so kind and uh, metadata name and all that. And also we had some fields that weren't absolutely needed here, like the provisioner name. I've gotten rid of them and uh, just put what's absolutely needed here. Um, what else? Other than that, Um, I've actually, yeah, finished out the driver gRPC API. I think it's ready for review at this point. One thing I can see being added here is actually maybe a few more diagrams to make things easier to understand. And but that's really just a nice to have. And more info about the architecture, like explaining how explaining why we have stuff like how do I put this? Only one controller manager. It kind of makes sense just as it is, but um, why only one controller manager, but multiple drivers and sidecars and a cluster-wide node adapter, and also things like how this leads to portability or scalability and things like that. But I don't know if that's absolutely needed for the alpha that we're shooting for, the alpha version that we're shooting for. So I think it's ready for review, to be honest. Like fully flushed out and everything. So okay, moving on to the next step.
So
I'm
Sid,
trying to go on.
can we paste the link to the doc on SIG Storage Cozy
Yeah,
and
yeah, sure,
get some input from the group?
for sure.
Some review
Yeah,
comments would be good.
would be really good. Yes. Um, yeah, I'll fix these things. Yes, that six storage cozy. All right. So there you go.
Thanks.
All right. Just gonna keep Slack closed because I don't want notifications to bother the meeting. All right, so that's where we are in terms of the cap. I believe I'm trying to remember where we left off last week. Um, I believe we were talking about uh, bucket infrastructure. Does anyone, can someone help me remember this? No. Can people hear me?
It, I'm trying to remember too. I thought we were still going on about the access, like so the bucket access and the exact fields that would be available in it.
Oh, I see.
Does that sound right? We shouldn't spend a lot of time in last week's meeting on that subject. I don't know if that was the sole subject.
So we were trying to work out, seemed like it was something really important. Um, So some of the things I followed up on were obviously the cap, and we were trying to architect it either had something to do with let me look back at the cap. Um, it had something to do with one of these structures. We were trying to figure out what needs to go where. I think we were trying to talk about um, not access granting. I think it was something to do with this structure, which is what goes into the pod. I believe that's what it was. Wait, let me.
It was okay. You're talking about the exact contents of the bucket.json file in the downward API.
Hmm.
Because the flow of information is the SP produces an access when you call grant access. We have to store that in our bucket access object. And then when
Right.
a pod gets bound to a bucket access, we have to read the information back out of the bucket access object and generate this JSON file. And so that the flow of the information goes from the SP to the bucket access object to the bucket to JSON file. And it all needs to look more or less the same in those three places, I think.
Yeah, it's a two-step process. So I mean, what goes into this file is a two-step process. The bucket name, endpoint, and region in this case, in the case of S3, would show up or would be filled in from the response to bucket provision or create bucket. All right, so let me remind where we were last week. Okay, so I just came back to me. So so this is going to be the new provisional create bucket call where you pass in name and parameters. We don't have any protocol structures that have protocol specific parameters going in, but the response field will have protocol specific structures that'll be filled in by the driver with appropriate information. Um, we remember we
Filled in
talked
by the driver in grant access, not create.
in create you get back some information, and in grant
All you
access you get back
should
some.
get is the bucket ID, right?
Um, uh,
How could you?
so the bucket name, region, and endpoint,
The name is an input. The ID is the output.
and then you're saying so this would work as well
Oh,
as the other one where is there any reason to choose one versus the other? Because so this would work. What you're saying would work where we get the entire bucket infrastructure back as a response to provisional grant bucket access.
yeah, that was my idea. You're right. Some of the fields could, in principle, be supplied back earlier, but they're not going to be usable by anyone until you grant access. So why not just return them all in bucket access? There has to be some corner case where like maybe you don't know the name until you grant the access or something, or maybe the name could vary per access under certain circumstances. I, I don't know.
Because the function itself, grant bucket access itself, the scope of it is to grant access and return the credentials. Having it do an extra step uh, would cause problems in terms of just what the API is supposed to do. Say for
Right,
instance,
but like things like bucket name are going to be protocol specific. So if we can keep the protocol specific stuff out of bucket create and have it only in bucket access, then I think we have a simpler API.
bucket name is going to be protocols. How does that like? Does that make a difference in terms of where the response comes from?
But yeah, like the specific field called bucket name that ends up in bucket.json is under S3, right? So
Mm.
if someone invents a new protocol, they might not have bucket name, they might have something else. And so that makes the bucket name a protocol specific field
Uh, but
at
can that not be a
the downward
response?
API level, right? But like at
Right, right.
the cozy level, bucket name means something different, which is how cozy is going to tell you what to call your bucket. But you can
Mm-hmm,
ignore that and use something else for your actual bucket name if you want.
mm-hmm. So it doesn't make a difference whether that field comes back as a response to create bucket or
Yeah,
grant access.
I think the difference is because it's a protocol specific field, if you put it in grant access, it's very easy to just sort of add it to the rest of the protocol specific fields. If you put it in bucket create, then bucket create also needs to have a protocol specific set of responses and some sort of a discriminated union struct on the reply from the gRPC that creates the bucket. And I was hoping that we could just avoid that and say, you know, the create bucket RPC is protocol agnostic. You know, the protocol is an input string that tells you what protocol you want, but you don't get any specific parameters that are dependent on the protocol.
Okay, so in this scenario, we would take the entire bucket, and the entire response from bucket access response, grant bucket access response, and store it into a secret, and anyone who requests it just gets that whole secret mounted into the file. Is that what
It,
that would is
I
that what we're
wasn't
saying?
I wasn't thinking of making it all a secret, but you're right that some of the information is secret, and if we just put it all in the bucket access, we have a security problem. So, uh,
We'll have to put it in a secret. That
well,
would
yeah, if you could somehow put part of it in the secret and part of it in the bucket access object, that might be a little bit nicer. But um, I sort of see where you're going.
Mhm.
Well, wait a minute. No, okay. So it's going to be a structured object that comes back from the gRPC, right? Like for
Right,
S3,
right.
like we're going to have exactly like these 5 fields, whatever they are. And so we can say, okay, for these 5 fields, these 3 are going to go in the bucket access in
Mhm.
some S3 specific portion of the Kubernetes object, and then these 2 are going to get shoved in a secret, the name of which will also be stored in the bucket access. And so we can do it on a field by field basis because all the fields are well defined, and there's no extra fields. So yeah, I don't see any problem with just putting the secret stuff in the secret and putting the rest of the non-secret stuff in the bucket access object and having code in the sidecar that does that.
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah, we can do that. So put the bucket. So it's just the bucket info should also reside in the bucket, right? So things like bucket name, region, and endpoint should also reside in the bucket, right? Not just in the access, not just in the bucket access,
Well, I'm not convinced that serves any purpose.
because that information is about the bucket. I mean, just in terms of um, like what it signifies, like what it's about.
You know, I know that a human might be interested in reading it, but like no computer would ever look at that information. No controller that we write needs that information for anything.
Well,
We don't.
it needs
We,
that information for finally creating that bucket.json for the workload.
right, but I mean, the thing that creates bucket.json could happily pull it out of the bucket access object instead of the bucket object.
I'm saying
So,
we don't have to put it in the bucket access object. In the bucket access object, we just have the secret name, and then we call it a day. We don't have bucket info in the bucket access object. Is what I'm saying. We Because someone who's writing the driver, it makes natural sense for them to expect to return credentials, but by asking them to return bucket info as well, it just seems.
well, you're returning the access info, which is all of the information you need to access the bucket
I
that is
see.
being
See,
referred to.
I
It's
see.
so. I mean, it's not impossible to do it the other way. It just feels cleaner to do it all in bucket access from where I sit. But I want to hear what other people think. Does anyone care? Um, like I'm just thinking in terms of less lines of code. If everything's in the bucket access, then bucket create becomes really, really simple. You don't have any sort of discriminated union. You don't have complicated structures inside your bucket object. All of the complexity that's protocol specific is all pushed into bucket access. And that feels easier to deal with just from a coding perspective. The only downside is like if you have multiple accesses, they'll all have copies of things like bucket name, bucket endpoint, yada yada. You know, the information gets duplicated, but like it's a couple of bytes. It's not a big deal.
Okay, so yeah, I would like input from others on this as well. So the
Well, then,
conversation. Go ahead, Jeff.
since there's multiple, I haven't read the latest CAP that Sid's been working on. But if the previous structure is the same, where there's a single Kubernetes bucket resource that is the abstraction of a backend bucket, and if there's multiple bucket access resources, because there can be different accessors to that same bucket, then it seems that there's a division there that's natural, where properties specific to a bucket would be in the bucket resource, and properties specific to accessing that bucket would be in the bucket access resource. Are you proposing something different than that, Ben?
I'm proposing that all of the protocol specific information is in the bucket access, and nothing that's protocol specific is in the bucket.
Would different accesses to the same backend bucket speak different protocols? It sounds redundant.
No, the protocol would be the same, but in principle, you could return different bucket names to different accesses as long as the backend system behaved correctly. Like I wouldn't recommend anyone does that, but it should be
But
harmless, right? Because it's just as far as Cozy is concerned, it's just a string that we're going to pass down to a pod that he's going to use to attach to the object store. Like we
No,
don't
but
care what it
no, I
is.
don't think we should. I don't think we should model things that are also possible because of Cozy. Like stuff like we shouldn't be modeling a scenario where one bucket can have multiple names. I think that's
No,
actually. Mhm.
I'm saying it, like as far as we're concerned, it doesn't matter. Like we wouldn't recommend anyone does that, but like we will store a name on a per bucket access object because it's a protocol specific piece of information. And so
maybe I'm missing something, but how do you, like, if I delete a bucket then, and Cozy needs to pass this operation to the driver, how does the driver recognize which bucket to delete,
Still have
Cozy
regardless of
does
access?
everything by bucket ID, right?
Yeah, right.
When you create the bucket, you return an ID, and from thenceforth, you can only refer to the bucket by its ID, which is a string that was generated by the driver and persisted inside the bucket object. Furthermore, like we would inhibit bucket deletion until all the accesses were gone, right? So if you tried to delete a bucket that still had an access, we would wait for the access to go away.
So what you're saying is that essentially in S3, the bucket name is just a protocol required field because S3 requires you to provide it when you access a bucket.
So there's the Cozy level bucket name that gets passed in from the sidecar, which the driver is free to ignore or to use as the actual bucket name if it wants, right? Or it can use it, it can mangle it, it can generate a new one, whatever it wants to do. And then it returns an ID back, and it has to generate an actual bucket name. And then when access is granted, it has to return that bucket name. But Cozy doesn't care what the S3 bucket name, S3 level bucket name is, because it's just going to shove that in bucket.json and let the pod use it. It's not going to ever use that string for anything. So it's effectively opaque.
So for in the AWS example, right, a bucket ID might be an ARN, right? Like a fully qualified.
It could be identical to the bucket name.
No, I know, but you're saying that essentially, like if I would look at this from more the having a unique identifier for my buckets, right? So I might use an ARN, which is a longer string that represents my bucket resource in the backend. But for the purpose of the protocol access, I need to just provide this bucket name, and this is just for bucket access reasons, right?
Right.
Okay, I see.
And the key is that for item potency, if you get retries on the create call with the same name, you have to be able to map that to the same ID reliably. That's the only trick, right? You can't literally generate a random ID every time you create a bucket, because if you get a retry, you need to return the same ID. So you don't generate two buckets in response to one request being repeated.
How do you do item potency for create though?
Well, that's why I'm saying you have to, for a given bucket name, you always have to return the same ID. And whether you store a table somewhere or hash it or return the string itself, like you have to have a way to do that. That's just
No,
what
but what's
what
the
idempotency
point of
means.
this again?
But who's creating the bucket name there? You mean the name of the CR?
Yeah, like the way this works in CSI is like the volume name is just whatever the PV object in Kubernetes got named, and that gets passed in, and that way, no matter how many times you retry the creation, you're using the same input string. It's always the same
So
volume name.
from the
So
perspective of the driver, the CR name is the
bucket
key,
name. Yeah.
right? It's the key to identify retries, basically.
Right.
Okay.
And yeah, so you can use that as your bucket ID that you return, or you can create a new one. But if you do create a new one, it has to reliably map back to the or from the
No,
input.
then so why are we modeling this? I'm confused. So are we still on topic about are we still talking about access info coming all from the bucket access response or grant bucket access response?
Yeah, but the confusion I thought was about, the bucket name now has two meanings, unfortunately. Like there is the bucket name at the cozy level, and there's the bucket name at the bucket.json level, and they don't have to be the same thing.
No, they have to be. So what we say is the name we pass in is expected to be the name of the bucket. You can't ignore it. Like we're not
It
saying
can, like, because it could contain invalid characters that aren't representable in that particular
then it should
system.
throw an error. I would rather have it that way than to make it just ignore it.
But okay, there's no guarantee that the names getting passed in are globally unique. And so what if the name gets
No, it is. We use bucket request dash UUID. So BR dash UUID.
but that's an implementation choice. Like at the cozy layer, we can't ensure that the strings that get passed in are globally unique.
I can create a bucket. Can't I just create a bucket with my own name? I mean,
yeah, exactly. Like I can call create bucket with the string foo, and if the driver happens to be attached to a storage system that already has a bucket named foo, like what am I supposed to do?
Return saying the foo already exists.
Return saying it already exists.
no, but Sid, I think the question is, does a cluster like the key space of those buckets in a cluster is not globally unique, right? You might have multiple clusters connecting to the same backend
Right.
S3
That's
service,
what I'm
right?
getting at. Like we can make the implementation choice to use UUIDs everywhere and thereby avoid this problem. But at the cozy spec layer, we can't force clients to do that. We just have to say, look, pass in a string, and for this particular instance of the cozy driver, the string has to be unique, but we can't require it to be globally unique because that's too stringent a requirement.
So I think that the bad thing about it is just like CSI, right? That you have multiple names for the same thing, and you always need to go through some mappings and confusion of which volume name this refers to.
You don't have to, but you have the option of doing it if you want to support something that scales globally, right? You're free to use the bucket name as the actual bucket name and as the bucket ID if that works in your particular implementation. But for ones where it doesn't work, you can do something else and it'll still behave correctly. That was the compromise for CSI, was that you have a volume name and you have a volume ID, and they can be different. And the driver is free to ignore the contents of the volume name as long as it uses it for idempotency purposes. That's the only thing it must be used for. And it's because there's nothing to stop someone from sending in a non-global unique name there and expecting to get something.
So who's creating, like, when I do the flow of bucket requests, right? When I'm provisioning asking for a provisioning, right. Who generates the bucket name? I assume it's the cozy controller.
No,
right?
no. The bucket request. Well, yeah, the bucket request name is just a Kubernetes object that a user creates, so it's named whatever that user chose. But
No,
then
that's
the
a
provisioner,
request, but the bucket
Yeah, the
itself
bucket.
would be
yeah, the
created by the
actual
controller.
bucket
Then it's
name is
record.
randomly generated.
No, it's just br-uuid of the bucket request.
Right. I mean, that's a way to randomly generate it, but yeah, it ends up being globally unique if we do that. And that's
So,
what
but
that's exactly what CSI did.
who makes the decision of how to name
Controller.
the bucket object? The controller, the cozy controller.
Yeah.
Yeah, the cozy
So
controller
it's not that the
decides.
driver can decide how to name those, and like it's a cluster global thing.
It's a completely global thing.
I mean, it's a cluster global thing. No, it's a CR within a cluster. So it's like if I have two drivers in my cluster for providing cozy, I can't have both of them selecting the same names colliding, right? So this is why cozy controller is taking a UUID before and saying this is the bucket identifier for the
Right.
cluster, right?
Right.
And then passing on this as an identifier for the driver so that it knows the request key, right? I'm provisioning a bucket with this ID, this UID, and it's like I can retry that, and the driver knows it's the same one. That works. But then the driver returns back a bucket ID, which might be very different, right? Or might be the same.
Right. No, it could be. It could be the same, but it can be different.
Yeah.
We don't impose any restrictions on that.
And also on naming, is there anything in the bucket request that like a prefix for the backend bucket that can be like there was once something like that, but I don't remember if it's still there. Like some control of the user workload on the backend bucket name, like any type of control, because one of the management issues we had with OBCs was that we've started having so many backend buckets with generated names, and nobody knew to which cluster they belong, to which namespace they belong, right? I mean, after clusters were already expired, like removed and dead for a while, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was quite difficult without having some user generated the prefix or anything like that to identify what like to manage this backend.
What you would like is like some metadata to get stored along with the buckets.
Mhm.
That has that kind of.
Yeah, we did it with a prefix for the name, right? Because we I'm just explaining what we did, but there was a problem there that a lot of teams were using the same. In our case, it was an AWS account, but it ended up, being swamped with stale buckets, which nobody knew to what they belong and who and which cluster, and it was really hard to manage this way.
Yeah, our customers had the same problem with CSI. Too many clusters all shoving storage onto the same thing and not cleaning up, and then someone had to go figure out who the garbage belonged to. And so we had a way of like stamping inventory information on all the volumes we created, just so that you have a hope of sorting it out later. So presumably with buckets, there's a way to attach metadata for inventory purposes or historical auditing, accounting purposes.
There are tags and things like that, but I think the main identifier is a name. Like this is what people typically look for.
Yeah, because it's vendor specific. It's not protocol specific. These tags
the name,
the metadata. So
sorry.
Yeah, so we have to rely on name. Yeah. Yeah. So just to close things on what we were discussing. So Ben, when you were asking earlier if a bucket 4 already exists, did you mean bucket 4 already exists in a different backend?
Like no, on the same storage controller, but created by like perhaps a different Kubernetes cluster that couldn't have known about the names that you chose.
I see.
So the problem is within a Kubernetes cluster, you can ensure the names are unique because the Kubernetes server will literally prevent you from creating one that collides with something else. But if you go to another Kubernetes cluster and have another cozy plugin that points to the exact same storage controller, nothing prevents you from recycling the names. And so the way CSI handled this is saying like it's only names are only promised or guaranteed to be globally unique within that instance of CSI, but not globally, because no one's in a position to guarantee that. You can only guarantee that it's unique within that instance. And so if it turns out that like you have a collision somewhere, the driver is empowered to disambiguate the two by mangling the name and or modifying the name or adding a prefix or adding a suffix and then returning a different string back for the ID, and saying that's how I want you to refer to it, if the driver wants to.
Right, and then we're adding to this another layer, which is the workload protocol layer bucket name, which we're saying it might also need to be different in some cases than
Right, I
the
mean,
identifier for cozy.
One would hope it would be
ID.
the same as the bucket name, but you're free to make it
But
something else.
you want to, yeah, so you want another level of freedom there because we're saying that the bucket IDs might be, I don't know, whatever, too long for the protocol, I don't know, whatever. Right?
Yeah,
Something.
There's a million reasons that people are going to say, well, I don't like that, do it different. And if we leave the flexibility in there to do it different, then people aren't going to yell at us.
The only requirement is the bucket name is used for idempotency.
Yes, that is how CSI did it, and I would advocate we do the same here.
I'm
the bucket CR name, though, right? That's not the bucket name from the protocol.
Right. The cozy gRPC bucket name, which is the CR name.
Right. So I think also I'm also like pretty. I look at this and I think it's all good, right? In the sense that all these flexibility layers are good because the ID is really something that might not be usable in the protocol, and the ID should be somewhat more than just the CR name because there might be multiple clusters. So these three make sense to me. The one thing that I'm missing is any type of like any level of control from somebody, either the user or the administrator, on the like the generated bucket names in the backend. I feel like it might be missing, or a little bit too difficult to manage without it.
Sorry, can you repeat that? What would be too difficult? Are you saying managing multiple different names?
Yeah, so I meant to say that managing. So I think we are missing some control from on the backend name, right? So the driver can provide it, but then if Cozy has no standard for it, might be a little difficult. I don't know. We might say that it's a vendor specific mechanism, but we put it in a bucket class or something like that. I don't know. It feels like a little maybe left out from the spec at this point. That there is no way for a user to control what is the backend bucket names that get created in some way. I don't know if prefixes make sense or not.
That's what you're saying. That's what you're saying. Yeah. So yeah, I see where you're coming from. For manageability, it makes sense to have something like that. And yeah, I can see there being a problem if we said, the driver will retain that mapping, because if that mapping is lost, then that whole information is lost. So like Ben was saying, we need a mechanism to store that metadata in the backend, right? Otherwise we can't do this.
Right, but that's not a Cozy concern. That's a
Right.
driver implementation concern.
Right, but can Cozy do something to make that easier?
Well, it's just a question of what information you want to store, and I think that the driver can get all the information it needs, right?
So no, let me put it this way. So for instance, if Cozy said all Cozy buckets start with Cozy dash and say Cozy dash some other identifier dash UID, or the bucket prefix, it need not be something that is set it's parameterized in the sense that you can't choose what it is, but Cozy always follows the standard of Cozy dash cluster name dash UUID, something like that.
That just makes the name longer. Like, I mean, if
No, it makes it easier for an admin later on to see which buckets came from which cluster. Let's say I have 10 Kubernetes clusters. Each of them are creating buckets.
right, but the driver, what I'm saying is the driver could already do that if it wanted to. Like whatever prefix we put on, the driver's free to strip off because we already said you're free to ignore the name or mangle it. And if you don't put a prefix on, the driver can add its own prefix, and the driver knows the name of the cluster, and it knows that it's Cozy, and so it could put Cozy. It could format the names the way you want to, and you're entirely free to do that within the driver. And I think that's the better way because there could be implementations where there's very severe length limits that we don't want to exceed. So we just want to give the minimal string from the Cozy layer for
that risk exists regardless. But I see what you're saying. I see what you're
like
saying.
leave
Yeah.
this up to the vendors to name their
Yeah.
buckets in a way that won't drive their administrators crazy, because they're
Look,
regardless of what we do,
more
they can
like,
do
see,
something different.
Cozy is a standard. We're trying to mandate what's the right way to use buckets. I mean, we're trying
Yeah.
to move the industry forward. I mean, I don't think it's such a terrible thing to mandate or try to give suggestions on how a bucket should be named. More than likely, vendors are just going to use the names that we provide. All the buckets names should be DNS addressable. So as long as it doesn't break the regex for URL. It should not even
Yeah.
not a complete URL, just a domain. Then
Yeah.
it should just work.
But the key is that like for all of the ones created by Cozy, they're going to have these random names and like that this is all automated buckets created by automation, right? So humans shouldn't be looking at the names and gleaning any information from them. The only thing humans are going to care about is like where did it come from? Not like what does the name mean, but like who owns this? What cluster is responsible for it? Like if I delete it, who's going to scream? Those are the kind of informations that you would want, if you're actually administering the back end and not the Kubernetes cluster. And the driver is free to like attach that kind of information in as needed. But like the individual names are just random. So, Alice will create some buckets and Bob will create some buckets. And the only difference at the Cozy layer is different UUID. That's the only difference between Alice's buckets and Bob's buckets.
So I agree. I mean, I think the drivers can do this. The drivers can certainly handle this, but isn't it something that all drivers should somehow think about?
Um,
Do you imagine
guess.
like a driver who shouldn't care?
I mean, for small scale test drivers, this is all irrelevant, right?
Yeah, probably, but it's probably not the world, right? The world is probably about the real storage vendors.
We could
drivers.
stand to have like a lessons learned from CSI where we talk about best practices and think about the case when there's multiple Kubernetes clusters sharing one of these things, and think about how to clean up messes when the Kubernetes cluster gets blown up and the storage doesn't. Think about having audit records or origin tags, labels, things. But then people have implementations that just don't have those things, and what are they going to do? They're not going to do anything. So,
you're correct. I mean, I could always make a driver that strips off whatever Cozy decided to tell it to put on the bucket name. It's like I can never have as Cozy real control over the backend bucket names for sure.
So I guess I like the idea of encouraging driver implementers to, label their buckets with enough information so that someone can figure out what happened. But it's not a concern for us. It's a concern for consumers and vendors, I think.
I think that it was really something that wasn't manageable from how we looked at it. And once we made sure that those those bucket names will just have the cluster name, some form of name, and it wasn't the UUID of the cluster, actually it was a name. And the reason is, like you said, the consumer of this name on the back end would be a human, or some script running for a human that would list all the buckets, filter them by some name that I'm currently interested of cleaning up, or something like that, right?
Yeah. So just to give, and I don't want to waste all the time on this topic, but like to give you an idea of what we did with Trident, we have all kinds of metadata that you can attach to the Trident driver object, and that gets stamped on the metadata that for the volumes that Trident creates. And it's very flexible, what you can put there. And so we don't have any dependency on CSI giving us useful information or Kubernetes giving us useful information. We just have, we just ask the user, like, what information do you want to be stamped on the volumes created by this driver on this back end, and we'll do it. And so you tell us that, and then we're responsible.
Right.
So it's something that can
be
handled
it's on
totally
you
on the side.
You're right, but then it's on you as a vendor to document it and explain it to your users.
Yeah. Yeah.
That
Would it
it's like
would it help if would it help if us as Cozy gave clear guidelines that it helps to have metadata about the cluster, the driver ID or something, and just information that can uniquely identify where this bucket came from.
Yeah, like, I like the idea of having a guideline, but the problem is how much guidance we can give quickly ends after, like, the name of the cluster and the name of the driver, and that's about all we can suggest that you put in there. In reality, people will put a lot more that we can't imagine in there. So we just, the guideline should just be like, put information in there.
It was also the namespace in our case, actually.
Yeah, but that's something that like CSI doesn't provide to you, and you would have to go get it yourself if you were really interested.
Same with Cozy.
Right. And that was by design in CSI, and you can debate whether it was a good idea.
Interesting. The namespace thing is very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we need some kind of audit trail about the bucket, on the bucket.
Well, I mean, Kubernetes has its own API.
Yeah, how does it work?
APIs.
How does it do audit trails? Like what? Like
I mean, the PVC is bound to the PV. So given a PV, you can find out what PVC is bound to, and you know that Kubernetes knows the namespace. It's just that the driver doesn't, because it's not relevant. So as long as you don't lose your Kubernetes database, you have all the auditing information you need. The problem that would occur is people would go create a bunch of PVs and then nuke the cluster.
Yeah.
And now that information is gone, and you just have a bunch of PVs hanging around. It's like, well, whose are these?
Yeah, it's true for a lot of backend resources, like I don't know, load balancers services. I'm just looking at AWS as an example, but there's more of those leaked resources on the backend. It's the problem, like, is always that people ask you as the provider of the driver or something, like, to provide some mechanism, and anybody can do it, right? I'm not saying you can't, but I'm pretty sure every driver will be required to do something like that.
So let's agree. We're going to provide guidance that you should do something about this, but it's kind of out of scope for us beyond providing the guidance.
That's absolutely true, actually.
So
we still give them the flexibility to add whatever information they want. Like, we're not preventing it.
Yeah, and so the only question I have is, do you think users creating a BR, right, would require any use case for tagging their buckets somehow? So I think it's the same. It's the same question from a different angle, right?
Yeah, instead of coming from the driver, you're asking the user level.
So the driver can do that for the behalf of the user if it can track back to which namespace created the BR and all that. But I'm a little bit like nervous about having no control from the user level of this on having no tags at all, right? As a user for what I'm creating, and I know I'm creating some heavier resource in the backend.
What if okay, so I'm just thinking of a solution. I'm not thinking through all of the different concerns that matter here, but just in terms of a solution, in provisional create bucket request, it's totally possible to share BR name, BR namespace, just any other information you'd like. Just like meta, we can call it like meta information or something, like a field called meta, which has stuff like that in it. And it's up to the driver at that point to use it or discard it.
Right. The reason we didn't do that with CSI is because CSI wasn't envisioned to be Kubernetes specific, and so like, what would namespace mean on something other than Kubernetes?
But Cozy doesn't have that requirement.
Right. I was going to say, if we're willing to tie ourselves to Kubernetes, then that argument goes away, and you can say, okay, we're going to provide a bunch of Kubernetes specific metadata that you can do with what you will.
I mean, even in CSI, we're basically bound to Kubernetes. I don't think anyone else is using CSI. I don't know if anyone else was using it. Maybe there's someone else.
Right. In practice, it's only Kubernetes, but at the time it was envisioned, there really were other companies that were not, that wanted to consume it, that were not doing Kubernetes. So anything that was Kubernetes specific was strongly pushed back against.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. I think, Guy, that would solve a problem, right? Like, what if we started passing in a meta field into all of the requests, actually, all of the create requests, create bucket requests, and grant bucket access requests, like a meta field. I don't mind calling it meta, which has just information about where this request came from.
Do you mean is this information something that I, as the creator of the BR, provide custom metadata that I can provide to the?
No, it'll just be Cozy inferred data, like the namespace from which the BR came.
So we will collect like so it will be another tiny schema of these fields that we add on to the request so that drivers can use to identify a workload within the cluster or something like that. Is that?
Or use that to construct a request or bucket name and metadata.
Yeah, I'm gonna think about it a little bit more. I think it does make sense. So because if we really open it to, so I mean, what we did eventually with OBCs, we did open it for the users to provide whatever they want to driver, but I know that for Cozy, it's not something we want to do because it will break portability in some way, or it can break portability. It can be an opening for it. Mm-hmm. So perhaps this is a something in the middle where the drivers can get enough information to identify the workload to the backend. So yeah, it makes sense that we'll see details. It sounds okay.
Yeah. Anyone else have any thoughts about this? I think in terms of manageability, manually managing it once the bucket is created and it's in the backend, this kind of information makes a lot of sense.
I just would add to Guy's point that we did learn some lessons with an earlier design for bucket provisioning in Kubernetes. And I think Guy has some real world experience in what some of those problems were for customers. And so I appreciate your input on this, Guy, and I would like to see Cozy do better in that area.
Yeah, I think this metadata going in through the driver would help a lot. But what kind of metadata would be in there? Let's talk about that. We have a few minutes. Maybe just a quick glimpse into what we should have. Can we discuss right now?
Is there any problem for the driver to actually have a copy in terms of data, right? Just getting the entire data of the BR for these requests? Like, is it something that doesn't make sense in the protocol, or just a matter of too much data
I mean,
to
bucket
pass
class
on?
name doesn't make sense. There are some fields which don't make sense, but there are some which do. Like bucket class name doesn't make sense. Deletion policy doesn't make sense.
Wait,
So
wait,
just
bucket class name doesn't make sense. That seems like it
to go to the driver, to go back to the driver. So we're talking about what
Why
goes
not?
makes a huge
Well,
amount
I
of
mean,
sense though. Like
to send to the driver. The driver has no idea what a bucket class, like what's in the bucket class. It's a set of parameters.
it makes as much sense as any other metadata that a user might shove in. Like,
I mean, I agree. The namespace or or the class name are both equally, in different setups will be equally
No,
relevant.
values in the class name would make more sense because with the class name, I can delete and recreate a new class with the same name but different configuration.
right. But I mean,
Yeah,
people still
namespaces
want to know, like,
too.
people want to know for historic reasons, was this a gold bucket? Was this a silver bucket? Like maybe in my specific installation, silver means different things on different days of the week. And so it's not so useful, but there are installations where it absolutely means something to somebody. I think that the most important thing is any of this kind of metadata, we have to explicitly say the driver is free to ignore all of this. This is, purely sort of for your information if you want to store it, but like if you drop all of it on the floor, you're still totally spec compliant, right? Like that would have to be the explanation in the cozy spec or in the cozy RPC is that
Yeah.
this is additional information useful for logging and audit tracking and labeling, but if you just ignore it, it's totally fine.
We need
Right.
to come
I
up with
agree with that.
yeah, we need to yeah, that's true. So we need to come up with a way to figure out what goes into the meta and what doesn't. I don't think we know what the answer.
But what if the entire BR goes in there? I mean, what makes it anything in the BR irrelevant for the purposes of logging and tracking? Is there anything that you might say, well, I would never want that to be part of my my logging or anything like
Deletion
that
policy.
for the driver? Yeah.
Deletion policy. Is the BR is here. Bucket class name protocol. Oh, deletion policy is not in the BR. Sorry, it's just protocol and bucket class name. Sure, we can put this whole thing in.
And the metadata, right? Also the entity
This is
metadata.
where I see the value. Yeah, but metadata is the real value, if you ask me. Bucket
Yeah, I
class
agree. I agree.
rather than
Both the name and the namespace, by the way, are
right,
very valuable, right? For
right.
the workload identification.
Right. But more than bucket class name, yeah, why not name, namespace, and labels rather than name, namespace, and bucket class name? Like those three make way more sense to me than having just the bucket class name. It makes sense to have the fields in the bucket class, but I don't know if it makes sense to have the name of the bucket class.
How about annotations?
Everything from the object meta, sure.
I'm sorry, guys. I really have to drop, but I'm gonna check back next time.
Yeah, I don't want to spend a huge amount of time debating like what we could put here, as long as it's pretty clearly ignorable.
Right. I think labels make sense because annotation is not identifying information about a resource, right? So I think annotation is not as much, though you could make a case for it, I guess. But name, namespace, labels makes a lot more sense to me.
I could see API reviewers pushing back on something like this eventually.
We'll talk more about it next Thursday. I think we're in a good spot. Please take a look at the cap. I've put it in our Slack group. Give your reviews.
Hold on, a thought just popped into my head, which could throw a wrench into this. What if someone just creates a bucket without a bucket request? That's still going to cause the provisioner to do its thing, right?
No metadata.
And there's no meta. And so what? Yeah, like you have to define what happens if just a bucket is created and it's not bound to anything. Do we leave the metadata blank? Is that okay? Like we're you have to document all those behaviors if we want to deal with this. If we
We
say
need to
it's,
even figure out what those behaviors are. I think we've just started this discussion. We don't have a clear answer on it yet. We should talk about it next Thursday.
but it's not going to get us closer to like getting the whole thing approved. So it feels like we're going
No,
down
I
a
don't think
cul-de-sac.
we're going to deal with this for V1 like alpha. This is post alpha.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't think we're not discussing about alpha anymore.
Okay.
Everything is going forward. All right. So yeah, I won't be talking about these things in the cap right now. Yeah, please take a look at the cap. The link is in the Slack group, SIG Storage Cozy. Give your reviews and leave your feedback on the PR itself. That'll help improve it before the API reviewers get a chance to even have to go through it. Yeah, that's all from me. Let's catch up again next Thursday, and we'll continue this discussion on metadata in the gRPC request.
Cool.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.